What remains after a civilization is shaken, not by war alone, but by something smaller than sight. Long after armies have withdrawn and palaces have fallen to dust, there are other traces left behind. A burial ground filled too quickly, a marketplace gone quiet, a prayer spoken over too many names. History often remembers kings, victories, and monuments. But beneath those familiar stories runs another current, older and more intimate, shaped by breath, fever, and the fragile fact of being human. Again and again, ancient societies believed they understood the terms of survival. They built roads, temples, laws, and granaries. They trusted gods, physicians, rulers, and the habits of daily life. Then, without much warning, an unseen visitor entered through a harbor, a trade route, a military camp, a crowded street. In a matter of weeks or months, what had seemed permanent began to feel terribly breakable. This is not only a story about disease. It is a story about how people respond when certainty begins to dissolve. Some turn to faith, some turn to reason, some searched for patterns in the sky, in the wind, in the bodies of the dying, and many simply tried to care for one another while the world they knew narrowed to the size of a room, a bed, a final conversation. Across centuries, these outbreaks altered far more than population counts. They weakened empires, erased lineages, unsettled belief, and changed the shape of memory itself. Entire chapters of human experience were rewritten not by conquest, but by invisible forces that move silently through the ordinary rhythms of life. What makes these episodes linger is not only their scale, but their mystery. Even now, some remain only partially understood. Their names survive. Their symptoms echo through old accounts. But the full truth still recedes from us, as if history itself were breathing through a veil. And perhaps that is where this journey begins, with the uneasy recognition that the past is not as distant as we imagine, and that the things we fail to see have often changed us most. What if the end of a world announced itself not with an army on the horizon, but with 12 ships drifting into harbor? In the autumn of 1347, the port of Messina watched vessels arrive from the sea, carrying a kind of silence no one understood. The sailors who remained alive were barely recognizable. Their bodies were swollen with dark knots of pain. Their breath came shallow and ragged. Before the city could truly grasp what had entered its gates, death had already stepped ashore. From Sicily, the sickness traveled along the very routes that had once made medieval Europe feel connected and prosperous. Merchant roads, crowded docks, inland markets, monasteries, and courtly towns became channels for contagion. Within months, the disease spread across the continent with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to those living through it. Families vanished behind closed doors. Church bells rang until there was no one left to ring them. The living learned to measure time by the rumble of carts collecting the dead. What people saw was terrifyingly physical. Fever, chills, swollen buboes in the neck, under the arms, along the groin. In some, blood filled the lungs. In others, delirium came before the end. Physicians searched for meaning in bad air, corrupted stars, divine anger, or imbalance in the body. But knowledge moved more slowly than fear. And fear, as it often does, looked for someone to blame. Yet the Black Death did more than kill. It exposed the hidden architecture of society. Labor became precious. Old hierarchies weakened. Religious certainty fractured for some and deepened for others. Art, prayer, medicine, and memory all changed shape under its shadow. We often call it a plague, as though that single word explains it. But perhaps what terrified Europe most was not only the scale of death. It was the discovery that the world it had trusted could be undone by something it could neither see nor command. It began, as many ancient disasters did, at the edge of empire, where soldiers, traders, and dust crossed paths beneath a hard and indifferent sky. In the 2nd century, Rome stood at the height of its power. Roads stitched continents together. Legions moved with discipline and confidence. Goods, languages, and ideas flowed from one province to the next. It was an age that seemed to promise order. Yet in 165 CE, returning troops from campaigns in the east may have carried home something far more enduring than victory, a disease the empire did not know how to name. What followed would later be known as the Antonine Plague. Contemporary accounts describe fever, diarrhea, inflamed throats, and eruptions on the skin that left the body marked if it survived at all. Many historians now believe it may have been smallpox or measles, though certainty remains beyond reach. For the people living through it, diagnosis mattered less than the terrible rhythm of loss. The illness moved through military camps, then into towns and cities, then into the bloodstream of the empire itself. Rome was built on connection, and that was part of its strength. But connection also meant vulnerability. The same roads that carried law and commerce carried contagion. The same army that defended the frontier could usher disaster across it. At its worst, some reports claim thousands died each day in the city of Rome. Whether those numbers were exact or not, the emotional truth is clear. The plague strained the empire's labor, weakened its military readiness, unsettled its economy, and filled its people with a sense that the old protections were failing. Even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, remembered for his stoic reflections on order and duty, ruled under this shadow. His writing speaks often of impermanence, of accepting what cannot be controlled, of meeting suffering without surrendering one's humanity. Reading those words now, it is hard not to hear the echo of a man governing through grief. The Antonine Plague did not topple Rome in a single stroke. History is rarely that simple. But it revealed how greatness can be undermined not only by enemies beyond the frontier, but by invisible pressures within. And perhaps that is one of the oldest lessons disease can teach. That power may look solid from a distance, while up close it is always resting on the vulnerable bodies of ordinary people. How does a civilization hear the first note of its own unraveling? Sometimes it sounds like coughing in a crowded street. Sometimes it sounds like the silence that follows when a city realizes it has run out of hands. In the middle of the 3rd century, Rome was no longer the confident power it had once seemed. Its borders were under pressure. Its leadership was unstable. Armies were fighting not only foreign enemies, but the chaos of succession, rebellion, and exhaustion. Then, as if history had decided that fracture alone was not enough, another epidemic spread across the empire. Later generations would call it the Plague of Cyprian, after the North African bishop who described its suffering in haunting detail. His words do not read like distant scholarship. They feel immediate, bodily, intimate. He wrote of relentless diarrhea, fever, vomiting, weakness in the limbs, throats consumed by ulcers, eyes inflamed and burning, feet failing beneath those still trying to stand. This was not just a wave of illness. It was a condition of collapse, one that unsettled both body and belief. Death was everywhere and not always quick. The disease likely arrived through the same networks that bound the empire together: military movement, trade, migration, urban crowding. Some modern scholars have proposed smallpox, measles, or even a viral hemorrhagic fever, but the exact cause remains uncertain. What is clear is its effect. Entire communities were destabilized. Agricultural work faltered. Tax systems weakened. Soldiers died. Public confidence thinned. And in a world already strained by political turmoil, plague became one more force eroding the idea of permanence. Yet something else happened in that atmosphere of fear. Communities of care emerged in unexpected places. Christian writers later remembered believers tending to the sick and burying the abandoned. Not because they were immune, but because suffering demanded an answer larger than self-preservation. Whether those accounts were idealized or not, they point to a truth that repeats throughout history. Catastrophe tests not only institutions, but compassion. The plague of Cyprian is often framed as part of Rome's long decline. That may be true, but perhaps its deeper meaning lies elsewhere. When systems fail and explanations run thin, what remains is the human decision of how to face one another. In times of widespread fear, that choice may be one of the last forms of strength a civilization has left. What happens when a great city survives war, ambition, and political intrigue, only to be brought to its knees by a fever no wall can keep out? By the 6th century, Constantinople stood as one of the brightest centers of the known world. It was wealthy, crowded, and alive with movement. Ships arrived daily with grain, animals, textiles, and rumor. Emperor Justinian dreamed of restoring Roman greatness, of gathering old territories back into imperial hands. On the surface, it was an age of confidence. Beneath that confidence, however, the empire was tied together by trade routes that carried more than prosperity. In 541 and 542, a deadly outbreak reached the eastern Mediterranean and then the imperial capital itself. Later known as the Plague of Justinian, it spread with terrifying force. Contemporary writers describe sudden fever, delirium, and the appearance of painful swellings in the groin, armpit, or neck. Some died within days. Others lingered in confusion and agony. As the number of bodies rose, normal rituals broke apart. There were too many dead, too few workers, and not enough space to mourn in the old ways. The disease is now commonly linked to Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium associated with later plague pandemics. But for those who lived through it, scientific certainty was far away. What they knew was this: the machinery of empire was faltering, trade slowed, food systems strained, military campaigns weakened, tax revenues declined. Even Justinian himself was said to have fallen ill, though he survived. The emperor remained, but the illusion of control did not. And yet the most striking image is not imperial. It is human. A porter collapsing in the street, a mother waiting beside a bed, clerks unable to record the names quickly enough, workers hauling the dead to mass graves, then returning for more. In moments like these, history loses some of its grandeur and becomes immediate again, built from ordinary bodies enduring extraordinary pressure. The plague did not end Byzantium overnight. Empires rarely vanish in a single season, but it altered the future in ways large and small, weakening what had seemed durable and exposing the fragility beneath magnificence. Perhaps that is the enduring ache of such events. They remind us that civilization is not a monument of stone, but a living arrangement of breath, labor, memory, and care. Can a disease change the course of a conquest before history even finds the right words for what happened? When Spanish ships reached the Americas in the early 16th century, they carried steel, horses, and a ruthless sense of purpose. But they also carried something less visible and far more devastating. Among the many forces that accompanied empire was smallpox, a virus with no interest in crowns or faith, yet one that would reshape both with terrible efficiency. For indigenous societies of the Americas, the encounter was not simply military, it was biological, emotional, and cosmological. Communities that had never been exposed to old world diseases had no inherited immunity to them. When smallpox spread, it moved through villages and cities with shocking force. Bodies burned with fever. A rash appeared, then deepened into pustules that covered the skin and entered the mouth, the eyes, the memory of everyone who survived to witness it. People were too weak to fetch water, prepare food, or bury the dead. In many places, the social fabric tore all at once. The epidemic that reached central Mexico in the wake of European contact likely played a crucial role in the fall of the Aztec Empire. It struck during a moment of political upheaval and war, killing enormous numbers, including leaders and experienced fighters. Yet to describe it only as a strategic advantage for conquest is to flatten the human reality. This was not merely a shift in power. It was the sudden loss of parents, priests, healers, artists, farmers, children, entire chains of memory severed in a generation. The same pattern echoed elsewhere across the hemisphere. Disease often ran ahead of direct colonial presence, spreading faster than foreign armies could travel. By the time conquerors arrived, some regions had already been hollowed by grief. The land was still there, the cities were still there. But the people who held stories, rituals, and relationships together had been taken in staggering numbers. In historical narratives, conquest is often told through battles and treaties. Yet disease reminds us that history is also made in the private space between pain and helplessness. Smallpox did not act alone, and it should never be used to erase the violence of colonial ambition. But it became one of the most tragic partners in that process, exposing how fragile a civilization can become when suffering arrives faster than meaning. And perhaps the hardest truth is this: sometimes the fall of a world begins before that world even understands what has entered it. What does a society do when the sickness returns and returns again until fear itself begins to feel inherited? Long after the first Great Plague waves had torn through empires, disease did not simply disappear into the past. It lingered in ports, in caravans, in crowded neighborhoods, in the movement of rats and grain and human need. The ancient and medieval worlds were not struck once. then spared. They were haunted repeatedly, each new outbreak reopening older wounds and reminding survivors that memory could be as heavy as mourning. In many regions, plague became less like a single catastrophe and more like a season of uncertainty that never fully ended. A city might recover enough to rebuild its markets, refill its workshops, and restore public rituals. Children would be born into streets that seemed alive again. Then another outbreak would come ashore or rise from the hinterland, and all the fragile confidence of recovery would begin to splinter. The result was not only demographic loss, but a slow reshaping of how people imagine time, risk, and the future. Records from different centuries reveal this pattern with painful consistency. Officials argued over quarantines and trade restrictions. Religious leaders led processions, prayers, and fasts. Healers worked within the limits of what they understood. Families weighed impossible choices: stay and care for the sick, or flee and risk carrying death elsewhere. Again and again, daily life became an ethical puzzle with no clean answers. Yet recurrence also changed institutions. Some cities developed more organized public health responses, however imperfect. Port inspections, isolation practices, burial regulations, and emergency provisions began to emerge not from abstract theory, but from repeated suffering. Outbreaks taught communities that survival required more than courage. It required systems, coordination, and an acceptance that human life is bound together in ways that comfort and endanger us at the same time. There is something especially haunting about a recurring epidemic. A single disaster can feel like fate. A returning one becomes a teacher no one asked for. It instructs by repetition, wearing away illusions of mastery while forcing a deeper question to the surface. If vulnerability is not an exception but part of the human condition, then what kind of wisdom can we build from living with that truth? What if the most devastating epidemics were not always the ones history named most clearly, but the ones that left behind only fragments? A letter, a chronicle, a city suddenly quieter than before? Some of the ancient world's most destructive outbreaks survive in records that are incomplete, disputed, or filtered through fear. A physician describes symptoms in one place. A monk counts burials in another. An official complains of labor shortages, abandoned farms, or tax revenues collapsing without fully understanding why. Across these scattered traces, we can sense the outline of disasters that shaped lives just as profoundly as the better-known plagues, even if their exact cause remains uncertain. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story, it is part of the story. Ancient people did not have microscopes, genomic tools, or modern epidemiology. They read the body through what they could observe and the world through what they believed. Bad air, divine displeasure, poisoned wells, corrupted seasons, celestial omens, these were not foolish inventions to them, but sincere attempts to make meaning when suffering arrived faster than explanation. In that sense, every old epidemic is also a record of the human need to understand. And still, the clues matter. Patterns of fever, skin eruptions, bleeding, respiratory failure, or intestinal collapse allow modern scholars to offer possibilities. Influenza, typhus, cholera-like illnesses, hemorrhagic fevers, smallpox, measles, plague. Yet every retroactive diagnosis comes with caution. The farther we reach into the past, the more history resists certainty. We are left with probabilities, not verdicts. But perhaps the deeper significance lies elsewhere. These shadowed pandemics remind us that countless lives can shape history without leaving full biographies behind. Farmers, midwives, laborers, children, traders, elders, their deaths may appear only as a change in census, a pause in construction, a thinning of military ranks. And yet those absences altered inheritance, memory, language, belief, and the emotional weather of entire societies. To study these half-seen epidemics is to confront a humbling fact. History is not only what is preserved, it is also what has been dimmed by time, waiting in silence for us to notice the human weight of what cannot be fully recovered. What kind of illness arrives like panic itself, without warning, without visible mark, and often without leaving enough time to say goodbye? In late 15th century England, As dynasties shifted and the country tried to steady itself after civil war, another threat began moving through towns and noble houses alike. People spoke of a sudden chill, then crushing heat, pounding fear, pain in the chest, dizziness, and a torrent of sweat so intense it soaked clothing and bedding within minutes. A healthy man could rise in the morning and be dead before nightfall. There were no dark swellings like plague, no telltale rash to read, no slow decline, only speed, only shock. The English called it the sweating sickness, and it returned in waves between 1485 and 1551. What made it so unnerving was not simply its lethality, but its personality. It seemed to favor the strong as much as the weak, the wealthy as much as the poor. It entered courtly circles, university halls, merchant homes. In a world accustomed to disease, this one still felt unfamiliar, almost intimate in its cruelty. It gave people barely enough time to understand that something was wrong. Even now, its cause remains uncertain. Scholars have proposed hantavirus, influenza, anthrax, or some now vanished pathogen carried by rodents or hidden in the conditions of the age. But no theory fully settles the matter. The disease appeared, spread with astonishing violence, then disappeared from history as abruptly as it had arrived. That vanishing may be the strangest part of all. For those who lived through it, explanation mattered less than the atmosphere it created. Any discomfort could feel like a sentence. Any knock at the door could bring news of another sudden death. It transformed ordinary bodily sensations into omens. Perhaps that is why the sweating sickness still feels modern. It reminds us that fear does not always come from what is most visible. Sometimes the deepest dread is born from the body's betrayal, swift, silent, and impossible to predict. What if a civilization's greatest vulnerability was not its enemy beyond the horizon, but the water it trusted each day? In the 19th century, cholera moved across the world with a force that felt both ancient and terrifyingly modern. It did not arrive with the drama of armies or collapsing walls. It came through wells, rivers, pumps, and contaminated streets. It traveled with trade, with empire, with the dense new patterns of urban life. And wherever it appeared, it exposed the hidden truth that a city could look advanced on the surface, while carrying danger in its most basic systems. The disease struck fast. Cramps seized the body. Vomiting and severe diarrhea drained strength with astonishing speed. Skin turned cold. Eyes sank. The living could seem to fade in front of one another in the space of a day. Whole neighborhoods learned to fear the cup, the bucket, the familiar source of water that had always promised life. In some places, panic spread almost as quickly as the illness itself. Rumor followed, distrust followed, and grief settled in where certainty had once lived. Yet cholera also transformed the way human beings understood disease. It pushed doctors, reformers, and ordinary citizens toward a new relationship with evidence. Instead of relying only on theory or inherited belief, some began to map cases, compare neighborhoods, trace patterns of contact, and ask practical questions about infrastructure. In that sense, cholera became a cruel teacher. It revealed that suffering was not always random. Sometimes it was built into the design of a city. This mattered far beyond medicine. Public health, sanitation, and civic responsibility began to take on new meaning. Sewage systems, clean water planning, and urban reform were not simply technical achievements. They were moral responses to repeated loss. They reflected the growing realization that survival in a crowded world depends on shared systems, not private luck. Cholera belongs partly to the modern age, yet its lesson feels timeless. The things that sustain us can also fail us. A river can nourish or poison. A city can shelter or endanger. And progress, when it is real, may begin with the humility to notice what has been quietly harming us all along. Why do some epidemics remain fixed in public memory, while others, no less devastating, drift into the margins like half-remembered dreams? Part of the answer lies in visibility. Some diseases leave unmistakable marks on the body or arrive in moments of dramatic upheaval, making them easier for history to narrate. Others move through communities more quietly, their damage dispersed across villages, seasons, and generations. They still alter the world, but in ways that are harder to frame as a single event. A famine worsened by infection. A war made deadlier by camp disease. A trade route transformed because too many ports became places of mourning. These stories rarely fit neatly inside one name. And yet, forgotten pandemics have shaped human history as surely as the famous ones. They changed migration patterns, weakened dynasties, altered labor systems, and forced people to reconsider what safety even meant. In some cases, they deepened inequality because the poor, the displaced, and the overworked faced the greatest exposure. In others, they unexpectedly disrupted old orders by reducing populations so sharply that labor gained value and authority shifted. Disease did not create every social change, but it often accelerated what was already unstable. There is also the question of memory itself. Communities remember what can be ritualized, recorded, and retold. But many losses happen below that threshold. A healer dies before passing on knowledge. A family line ends. A local custom disappears because no one remains who fully recalls it. These are not always the losses that fill chronicles, yet they may be the ones that most deeply reshape a culture from within. To look back at ancient pandemics, then, is not only to count the dead or identify pathogens. It is to consider how fragile continuity really is. A society depends on more than monuments and rulers. It depends on transmission of care, of craft, of stories, of practical wisdom, of trust between generations. Perhaps that is why epidemics feel so haunting across time. They do more than threaten life in the present. They interrupt the quiet handoff by which the future is taught how to remember the past. What do people reach for when medicine fails? Explanation, ritual, or one another? Across ancient and early modern pandemics, one pattern returns with quiet force. When certainty breaks down, human beings do not stop searching for meaning. They pray, they observe, they argue, they write. They invent rituals for grief when old rituals can no longer contain it. In times of epidemic, the body becomes a site of fear, but also of interpretation. Every symptom asks a question. Every death demands a story large enough to hold it. Some turn to religion, seeing pestilence as judgment, warning, or trial. Others look to nature and reason, trying to trace illness through seasons, air, water, or contact. Most live somewhere between those worlds. A mother could whisper a prayer over a sick child and still seek the help of a healer. A city official could order processions and sanitation measures in the same week. Human beings rarely respond to disaster with one language alone. We reach for whatever might restore shape to the chaos. This search for meaning was not merely intellectual. It changed behavior. Epidemics inspired acts of generosity and acts of cruelty, moments of solidarity, and moments of suspicion. Some people cared for neighbors at great personal risk. Others fled, denied, accused, or withdrew. Under pressure, character became visible. Not perfectly, not heroically, but unmistakably. Disease had a way of revealing what communities valued when comfort was no longer available. And from that pressure, new forms of thought sometimes emerged. Public health measures, hospital traditions, burial reforms, systems of quarantine, ideas about civic duty, all were shaped, in part, by repeated encounters with mass illness. Suffering did not automatically produce wisdom, but it often forced societies to ask better questions. That may be one of the hardest truths in this history. Epidemics expose vulnerability, yet they also illuminate connection. No one falls ill entirely alone. The chain of breath, touch, labor, and care binds us long before we choose to notice it. Perhaps that is why every plague is also a mirror. It reflects not only what harms a society, but what that society becomes when tested by the frailty it hoped it could outrun. What, in the end, do these long-vanished pandemics leave behind? Not only graves, not only ruined economies or interrupted empires, but a deeper awareness of how precarious every human structure has always been. When we look across the ancient world, the pattern is unmistakable. Disease moved along the same lines as ambition. Roads, ships, armies, markets, pilgrim paths. The very systems that made civilizations vibrant also made them permeable. Exchange brought wealth and culture, but it also carried exposure. In that sense, epidemics were never outside history. They were woven into it, traveling through the channels people built in pursuit of connection and power. And still, the most enduring legacy may be quieter than political change. It lives in the adjustments people made after the worst had passed. A city redesigns its water supply. A community changes burial customs. A family tells a cautionary story to children who never saw the outbreak themselves. A ruler funds physicians. A monastery records names. A survivor learns to think of ordinary mornings as something less guaranteed and therefore more precious. These changes are easy to miss because they do not always announce themselves as turning points. Yet this is often how history truly moves, not only through dramatic collapses, but through altered habits of care, altered definitions of safety, altered understandings of what it means to live among others. Pandemic memory becomes part of culture, even when the original terror fades. There is a tenderness in recognizing this. Ancient people were not simply victims of mysterious forces. They were observers, caretakers, adapters, mourners, and meaning makers. They endured confusion without the tools we now take for granted, and still they found ways to continue. Their worlds changed, their losses were real, but so was their persistence. Perhaps that is the final lesson before the story closes. The past does not speak only through catastrophe. It speaks through resilience shaped by catastrophe, through the fragile but stubborn human effort to keep building life after the invisible has passed through it. And so we arrive at the quiet edge of the story, where statistics fall away and only the human question remains. How should we remember what once moved unseen through the lives of millions? The pandemics that devastated ancient civilizations were not interruptions to history. They were history. They altered the fate of empires, changed the balance of power, disrupted belief, and exposed the delicate scaffolding beneath every society that imagined itself secure. Yet their deepest meaning may lie somewhere more intimate. They remind us that civilization has always been a living arrangement of vulnerable bodies, shared systems, fragile trust, in the hope that tomorrow will resemble today. Again and again, that hope was broken. Cities that believed themselves eternal learned otherwise. Families lost not just loved ones, but continuity, inheritance, and the ordinary rhythm of being together. Knowledge disappeared when those who carried it died too soon. Confidence disappeared when familiar explanations no longer fit. And still, after each wave of suffering, people returned to the work of living. They buried the dead. They rebuilt roads and markets. They revised old assumptions. They searched for better ways to protect one another. They kept going. That persistence is not triumph in the grand dramatic sense. It is something more modest and perhaps more profound. It is the stubborn human refusal to let grief be the final author of meaning. Even in ages without modern science, people observed, adapted, cared, and remembered as best they could. Their understanding was incomplete, but their humanity was not. To study these lost pandemics is to encounter both our limits and our continuity. The names change, the empires change, the explanations evolve, but the essential experience remains familiar. Fear of the unknown, longing for answers, the ache of separation, the need for compassion, the fragile miracle of endurance. Perhaps that is why these ancient outbreaks still speak to us now. They ask us to remember that history is not only a record of power, it is also a record of vulnerability and of the quiet courage required to live honestly within it. In that recognition, the past stops feeling remote. It becomes a mirror, asking what kind of care, wisdom, and memory we will leave behind for those who come after us.